The next few days unfolded like a whirlwind, though for Tasha, every hour felt like a test of endurance. She divided her time between Jalen's bedside and the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area, her body weary from sleepless nights and her mind heavy with the looming weight of bills and uncertainty. The nurses praised her devotion, but she knew they also pitied her. She saw it in the way their eyes softened when they handed her meal vouchers or reminded her gently that visitors had to step out during certain procedures. Pity was something she despised almost as much as poverty itself. It was a mirror reflecting back the life she had tried so hard to keep from defining her. Yet pity was not what she felt in Malik's presence. His return visits became a pattern, though she never asked him to come. Some days he would stay for hours, speaking little, simply keeping her company as she watched over Jalen. Other times he brought coffee, books for her to read, or small toys that he quietly left on the table in Jalen's room without ceremony. The nurses noticed, of course, they always noticed, but Malik moved with a quietness that discouraged questions. He seemed to know instinctively that Tasha did not want spectacle or attention. She wanted dignity, the simple recognition of being treated as more than a charity case. Still, outside the sterile safety of the hospital walls, the story was growing louder. News outlets ran daily segments speculating about Malik's mystery companion. Social media exploded with debates, some praising his compassion, others accusing him of staging a performance to soften his corporate image. A few voices, cruel and careless, painted Tasha as an opportunist who had conveniently appeared in his path. She refused to read most of it, but sometimes the words found their way to her phone screen, uninvited, slicing her like glass. She kept her head down, trying to shield herself and her son from the storm of opinions, but invisibility had already slipped from her grasp. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the hospital ward, Malik found her sitting alone in the waiting room. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped a hospital bill she had finally dared to open. The number printed at the bottom was obscene, so large she could not even process it. It may as well have been a foreign language, for it represented a world she could never access. She had fought so long to keep her head above water, but this bill was an anchor that threatened to drag her under. Malik sat down beside her, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp with awareness. He glanced at the paper in her hands, then back at her face. "It's too much," he said quietly, not as a question but as a truth he already knew. Her throat tightened as she fought the urge to crumble. She wanted to scream, to tell him she already knew it was impossible, that she had no way forward, that the system was designed to break people like her. Instead, she forced herself to swallow the words and looked away, her jaw set. "I'll figure it out," she muttered, though her voice cracked on the last word. "You shouldn't have to," he replied firmly. His tone carried no arrogance, no condescension, only the quiet conviction of someone who had dedicated his life to fighting injustices he could never undo, but refused to ignore. She turned to him then, her eyes blazing with a mix of fear, anger, and something else she couldn't name. "You don't understand. If I let you pay for this, if I let you step into my life like that, then what does that make me? What do people see when they look at me? A woman who couldn't stand on her own. A woman who had to be rescued. I can't be that, not for myself, not for Jalen." Malik listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. When she finished, trembling from the intensity of her own words, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "You are already more than that. You are a mother who carried her son through a storm with her bare feet bleeding. You are a woman who has worked herself to exhaustion to keep him alive. Accepting help does not erase that. It doesn't make you less, it makes you human. And if anyone chooses to see otherwise, that's their blindness, not your failure." The words pierced through her defenses, settling deep in the cracks of her exhaustion. She wanted to reject them, to push him away and retreat into the hardened shell she had built for survival. But something in his tone, the raw sincerity, the unshakable respect, disarmed her. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a burden, not as a statistic, but as a person. The weight of that recognition was almost unbearable in its gentleness. They sat in silence after that, the hospital around them humming with its usual rhythm, but the space between them charged with unspoken truths. Tasha felt her chest ache with a confusing mix of emotions: gratitude, fear, longing, and the fragile beginnings of trust. She had not asked for this man to step into her life. Yet his presence had already shifted something fundamental. The collision of their worlds was no longer accidental. It was becoming inevitable, and the thought both terrified and comforted her. Later that night, when she returned to Jalen's bedside, she found one of the toys Malik had left, a small wooden train with bright red wheels, placed gently beside her son's hand. She touched it lightly, her fingers trembling, and for the first time since the storm, she allowed herself to imagine a world where kindness did not always demand repayment, where help could be offered without cost, and where love might bloom in the unlikeliest of places. But even as hope stirred faintly in her chest, fear whispered its warning. The world was not kind to women like her, and life had taught her that blessings often came disguised as battles. The question was no longer whether her path and Malik's had crossed, but whether she was strong enough to walk alongside him into the storm that lay ahead. The next few days unfolded like a whirlwind, though for Tasha every hour felt like a test of endurance. She divided her time between Jalen's bedside and the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area, her body weary from sleepless nights, and her mind heavy with the looming weight of bills and uncertainty. The nurses praised her devotion, but she knew they also pitied her. She saw it in the way their eyes softened when they handed her meal vouchers, or reminded her gently that visitors had to step out during certain procedures. Pity was something she despised almost as much as poverty itself. It was a mirror reflecting back the life she had tried so hard to keep from defining her. Yet pity was not what she felt in Malik's presence. His return visits became a pattern, though she never asked him to come. Some days he would stay for hours, speaking little, simply keeping her company as she watched over Jalen. Other times he brought coffee, books for her to read, or small toys that he quietly left on the table in Jalen's room without ceremony. The nurses noticed, of course, they always noticed, but Malik moved with a quietness that discouraged questions. He seemed to know instinctively that Tasha did not want spectacle or attention. She wanted dignity, the simple recognition of being treated as more than a charity case. Still, outside the sterile safety of the hospital walls, the story was growing louder. News outlets ran daily segments speculating about Malik's mystery companion. Social media exploded with debates, some praising his compassion, others accusing him of staging a performance to soften his corporate image. A few voices, cruel and careless, painted Tasha as an opportunist who had conveniently appeared in his path. She refused to read most of it, but sometimes the words found their way to her phone screen uninvited, slicing her like glass. She kept her head down, trying to shield herself and her son from the storm of opinions, but invisibility had already slipped from her grasp. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the hospital ward, Malik found her sitting alone in the waiting room. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped a hospital bill she had finally dared to open. The number printed at the bottom was obscene, so large she could not even process it. It may as well have been a foreign language, for it represented a world she could never access. She had fought so long to keep her head above water, but this bill was an anchor that threatened to drag her under. Malik sat down beside her, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp with awareness. He glanced at the paper in her hands, then back at her face. "It's too much," he said quietly, not as a question but as a truth he already knew. Her throat tightened as she fought the urge to crumble. She wanted to scream, to tell him she already knew it was impossible, that she had no way forward, that the system was designed to break people like her. Instead, she forced herself to swallow the words and looked away, her jaw set. "I'll figure it out," she muttered, though her voice cracked on the last word. "You shouldn't have to," he replied firmly. His tone carried no arrogance, no condescension, only the quiet conviction of someone who had dedicated his life to fighting injustices he could never undo but refused to ignore. She turned to him then, her eyes blazing with a mix of fear, anger, and something else she couldn't name. "You don't understand. If I let you pay for this, if I let you step into my life like that, then what does that make me? What do people see when they look at me? A woman who couldn't stand on her own. A woman who had to be rescued. I can't be that, not for myself, not for Jalen." Malik listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. When she finished, trembling from the intensity of her own words, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "You are already more than that. You are a mother who carried her son through a storm with her bare feet bleeding. You are a woman who has worked herself to exhaustion to keep him alive. Accepting help does not erase that. It doesn't make you less, it makes you human. And if anyone chooses to see otherwise, that's their blindness, not your failure. The words pierced through her defenses, settling deep in the cracks of her exhaustion. She wanted to reject them, to push him away and retreat into the hardened shell she had built for survival. But something in his tone, the raw sincerity, the unshakable respect, disarmed her. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a burden, not as a statistic, but as a person. The weight of that recognition was almost unbearable in its gentleness. They sat in silence after that, the hospital around them humming with its usual rhythm, but the space between them charged with unspoken truths. Tasha felt her chest ache with a confusing mix of emotions: gratitude, fear, longing, and the fragile beginnings of trust. She had not asked for this man to step into her life, yet his presence had already shifted something fundamental. The collision of their worlds was no longer accidental. It was becoming inevitable, and the thought both terrified and comforted her. Later that night, when she returned to Jalen's bedside, she found one of the toys Malik had left, a small wooden train with bright red wheels, placed gently beside her son's hand. She touched it lightly, her fingers trembling, and for the first time since the storm, she allowed herself to imagine a world where kindness did not always demand repayment, where help could be offered without cost, and where love might bloom in the unlikeliest of places. But even as hope stirred faintly in her chest, fear whispered its warning. The world was not kind to women like her, and life had taught her that blessings often came disguised as battles. The question was no longer whether her path and Malik's had crossed, but whether she was strong enough to walk alongside him into the storm that lay ahead. The day after the storm stretched into a blur of conversations with doctors, visits from nurses, and the monotonous buzz of hospital machinery. Though Jalen's condition had stabilized, Tasha could not quiet the gnawing worry that pulsed in the back of her mind. Recovery did not erase the bill that would inevitably come, nor did it fix the fragile reality of her life outside these walls. Each time a nurse mentioned the financial office or handed her a clipboard filled with forms she could not understand, her chest tightened. She would nod politely, promise to look over the paperwork, then tuck it into the bottom of her bag as though hiding it there might somehow make the problem disappear. But the truth lingered, unrelenting. Her son was safe for now, but their world was still precarious, and safety had always come with a price she could not afford. Malik returned that afternoon, again dressed without pretense, a dark hoodie and plain trousers that stripped away the billionaire gloss most people associated with his name. Tasha noticed the way people reacted to him even without the armor of wealth displayed. Nurses straightened, orderlies glanced twice, strangers in the waiting area whispered quietly. He carried presence the way some carried scars, visible whether he tried to conceal it or not. When he approached her, his expression was calm, but she sensed beneath it a kind of determination, as though he had made a decision overnight and was now simply waiting for the right moment to reveal it. "I spoke with the doctors," he said gently, lowering himself into the chair beside her. "They're optimistic. Jalen's young, strong. With treatment and rest, he'll make a full recovery." Relief washed through her again, though it was tinged with the bitterness of reality. "I know," she said softly. I keep thinking about what could have happened. If you hadn't stopped, if I hadn't gotten him here in time." Her voice faltered, and she pressed her palms together tightly in her lap. "I can't let myself imagine it." Malik's gaze softened, and for a moment silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rhythm of beeping machines. Then he spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of memory. "I know what it's like to lose someone because help didn't come fast enough." She glanced at him, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. He had shared a piece of that story the night before about his sister Illa, but now she could see in his eyes the depth of the wound it had left behind. He wasn't telling her to comfort her. He was telling her because he understood. The difference mattered. They sat like that for a while, two people from opposite ends of the city, opposite ends of fortune, bound together by grief and love for their children. Yet Tasha's wariness remained. She appreciated his kindness, even the comfort of his presence, but a voice inside her warned against accepting too much. Life had taught her that gifts often came with strings, that charity could quickly sour into control, and that pity was the most suffocating chain of all. Her suspicions were tested sooner than she expected. Later that evening, after checking on Jalen again, Malik returned with a folder tucked under his arm. He laid it on the chair between them, his expression calm but deliberate. "I know you don't want to think about this now, but the hospital bills." Tasha stiffened immediately, her spine straightening, her breath catching in her throat. "Don't," she said quickly, her voice sharp with defensive edge. "Don't say it." "You don't have to carry it alone," Malik continued gently, ignoring the sting in her tone. "I can help quietly. No one needs to know." Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I said don't. I can't. Look, I'm grateful more than you know, but I don't need charity. I've been working 2 jobs to keep my son alive. I can't let anyone take away the little dignity I've managed to hold on to." The firmness of her response startled even her, but she could not take it back. Years of struggle had carved pride into her bones, and though it often cost her more than it gave, it was the one thing she could not surrender. Malik studied her quietly, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. "It's not charity," he said. "It's compassion. There's a difference. But I respect your decision." The words disarmed her, softening the rigid wall she had thrown up. She looked away, ashamed of her outburst yet unwilling to apologize for it. "You don't understand," she murmured, her voice quieter now. "People like me, we don't get second chances. We don't get safety nets. We fall, we hit the ground. That's it." Malik leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the glass window of the ward where Jalen lay sleeping. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't understand fully, but I've seen enough to know it isn't fair, and I've spent most of my life trying to build something that changes that. Not for headlines, not for recognition, for people like you, like Jalen, for Illa." Her chest tightened at the quiet conviction in his voice. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself accept that not every offer of help was laced with pity or self-interest. But trust came hard to her, especially with someone whose world seemed so different from hers it might as well have been another planet. Before she could respond, a commotion broke out at the far end of the hallway. A pair of reporters had somehow slipped past the hospital staff, their cameras flashing as they called Malik's name, demanding statements about the rescue and speculating about his connection to the woman and child. Tasha's stomach dropped as one of them lifted a camera toward her, snapping a picture before she could turn away. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she hissed, her voice trembling with both fear and fury. "They're going to drag me and my son into this circus. He can't live like that." Malik's jaw tightened as he rose to his feet, his height and presence suddenly formidable. He strode toward the reporters, his voice firm but controlled as he demanded they leave the premises. Security arrived moments later, ushering them out, but the damage had been done. Tasha's photo would now live in 1,000 feeds, a nameless woman tethered to a billionaire's narrative. When he returned, she was trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. "You should have just left me in the rain," she whispered bitterly. "At least then I'd still be invisible." Her words cut him more deeply than she realized. He crouched slightly so their eyes met, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "I couldn't walk away." "Not from you, not from him, and I won't now, no matter what they say. You're not invisible, and you never should have been." The words silenced her. For the first time she felt the full force of his sincerity, not just wealth wrapped in kindness, but a man who believed every word he spoke. Yet the very strength of his conviction frightened her. It meant that this moment, this fragile connection, was no longer something she could dismiss as fleeting. Their lives had collided, and whether she wanted it or not, the impact would leave marks neither could ignore. Liv's Collide morning sunlight spilled across the city in pale gold, a deceptive calm after the storm that had nearly stolen everything from Tasha Williams the night before. The streets of Chicago still bore the scars of the downpour, branches scattered across sidewalks, puddles gathered in every low place, and the air carrying that damp, metallic scent of rain-soaked concrete. Inside Northwestern Memorial, however, time had its own rhythm, measured not by the sun or storm but by the steady beeping of monitors, the clipped footsteps of nurses, and the constant shuffle of medical staff whose days bled seamlessly into nights. Tasha sat in a stiff chair outside her son's room, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep yet stubbornly fixed on the glass panel that separated her from Jalen. He lay still beneath the soft blanket, his chest rising and falling with the assistance of oxygen, his tiny hands curled against his sides. The doctors had reassured her that he was stable, that with careful monitoring and treatment he would recover, but the sight of him so small and fragile against a backdrop of wires and tubes twisted her heart with fear. A mother's instinct clung to every worst possibility, even when hope was offered. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket, dragging her back to the present. She ignored it the first few times, then finally pulled it out to silence the notifications. What she saw on the cracked screen made her stomach sink. Headlines blared from local news apps and social media feeds. Chicago tech billionaire rushes child to hospital in rainy rescue. Another read, hero or publicity move. Malik Jordan seen aiding struggling mother. And then, worst of all, a gossip site splashed a grainy photo of her soaked and disheveled in the rain, clutching Jalen against her chest, her face twisted with terror, while Malik knelt beside them. Her cheeks burned as she scrolled through comments. Strangers speculated about who she was, some calling her a scam artist who had staged the scene to get attention, others pitying her, still others accusing Malik of using her as a pawn in some calculated act of charity. Her name wasn't mentioned yet, but it felt inevitable that it would be. She locked the phone with trembling hands, pressing it to her lap as if to quiet the noise of the world. She had no bandwidth for public scrutiny. She barely had the strength to hold herself upright after a night of fear and prayer. And yet, the world did not wait for her permission to intrude. A nurse approached quietly, her expression kind but tinged with practicality. "Ms. Williams, the billing office needs to confirm insurance details for Jalen's treatment. When you have a moment, please stop by the desk." The words landed like stones in Tasha's stomach. Insurance. She had none. Not anymore. The diner where she worked had cut back her hours and eliminated benefits months ago. She was behind on rent, behind on everything, and the thought of facing a hospital bill large enough to rival a year's salary made her chest tighten with panic. She nodded stiffly, thanking the nurse before retreating back into the chair, her hands gripping the edges of her phone as though it were the only thing anchoring her. When Malik Jordan walked into the ward later that morning, it was as though the air shifted. He wore no tailored suit this time, just a black sweatshirt and jeans, but even dressed simply, he carried an aura that drew eyes. Nurses glanced up as he passed, their expressions flickering with recognition, and a pair of interns whispered to each other, nudging toward him. Tasha stiffened when she saw him approaching, part of her grateful for his presence, part of her wary of what it might mean. "You're back," she said softly, her voice a mixture of surprise and something unspoken. "I wanted to check on Jalen," he replied, his eyes moving immediately to the small figure behind the glass. For a moment he said nothing more, his gaze heavy with quiet remembrance. "How's he doing?" "The doctors say he'll be okay," she answered, brushing a hand across her forehead. "Pneumonia. They're keeping him here for a while." Malik nodded, his jaw tightening slightly as though he were carrying his own memory of long hospital nights. "That's good," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he looked back at her. "And how are you?" The question caught her off guard. People rarely asked. The world was quick to measure her worth in terms of what she could endure, not how she felt. She opened her mouth to say fine, the automatic answer that required no vulnerability. But something in his eyes stopped her. She exhaled shakily. Tired, scared, overwhelmed. The truth spilled out before she could contain it. He nodded slowly as though he understood more than she had intended him to. "It's a lot to carry," he said. The silence that followed was thick, not awkward, but weighted with truths that neither quite knew how to voice. She studied him warily, still unsure what to make of a man whose life was galaxies away from hers, yet who sat beside her now, as though they occupied the same world. She wanted to ask why he cared, what drew him back to her and her child when he had no obligation, but she feared the answer. She feared charity wrapped in pity, feared being someone's good deed for the weak. Still, there was something in his presence that made her feel less alone, and she clung to that against the rising tide of worry in her chest. The hours stretched on, each one dragging like an eternity. Hospitals had a way of bending time, of making minutes feel like days when someone you loved was behind those closed doors. Tasha sat with her shoulders hunched forward, her palms pressed, together in a nervous clasp as though she were holding herself from coming undone. Every so often she would look up at the glowing red numbers of the wall clock, expecting more news, craving reassurance. But the silence of the ward gave her nothing. Her chest still ached from the panic of earlier, and her throat was raw from screaming her son's name into the storm. Malik remained beside her, as constant as the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was strange, almost unreal, to see a man whose face she had only glimpsed in articles about technology and wealth, now sitting quietly in a cheap plastic chair, his coat folded across his lap, his eyes steady. The aura of power and polish he had carried when he stepped out of the limousine was still there, but muted now, wrapped in something human, something vulnerable. He spoke little, and when he did, it was only to ask if she needed water, or if she wanted him to get the nurse again. But his silence was not uncomfortable. There was a kind of unspoken solidarity in it, the recognition that sometimes words only intruded where presence alone could comfort. Eventually, the doctor returned with better news, and Tasha was allowed into the pediatric intensive care unit. The sight of her son, though tangled in wires and tubes, filled her with a relief so fierce it nearly buckled her knees. She pressed her lips against his tiny hand, whispering prayers of gratitude and promises of protection she wasn't sure she could keep, but meant with every fiber of her being. She stayed at his bedside for as long as the nurses allowed, whispering softly, stroking his curls, humming lullabies through her tears until exhaustion forced her to rest. When she stepped back into the waiting area, Malik was still there, though the lines of fatigue had deepened around his eyes. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly, her voice carrying both gratitude and confusion. "I know," he replied, "but I couldn't leave." His gaze met hers with quiet intensity, and she sensed that the statement carried more weight than he intended to reveal. Perhaps it wasn't just about her son, but about ghosts of his own that still haunted him. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Something passed between them, something fragile but undeniable, as though the storm outside had shifted them both into a new current they hadn't expected to share. Tasha felt her defenses stir, the instinct to push away help she didn't ask for, to question motives, to protect herself from disappointment. But she also felt her exhaustion disarm her. She could not summon suspicion in the face of the raw compassion she saw in his eyes. The night slowly melted into dawn. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind a city slick with rain and littered with broken branches. The hospital windows reflected the soft gray light of morning, and the air in the waiting room grew colder, quieter, emptied of the rush of emergency. Malik finally stood, smoothing his coat back over his shoulders. "My driver is ready," he said, hesitating as if searching for the right words. "But I wanted to make sure you were all right before I left." "I will be," she answered, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "You're stronger than you think," he told her. And for reasons she couldn't explain, the words sank deep, warming her like the tea he had handed her earlier. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage, but it carried the weight of everything she felt: gratitude, humility, a quiet recognition that she had needed someone, and that someone had answered. Malik inclined his head slightly, then turned toward the glass doors. As he stepped into the pale light of morning, she felt an unexpected pang of loss, as if a thread had been cut. She told herself it was absurd. He was a stranger, a billionaire, no less, a man whose life could not possibly intertwine with hers beyond this night, and yet something in her heart resisted letting the moment go. The next morning, headlines blared across local news outlets. Black tech billionaire saves mother and child in rainy Chicago drama. Some called it a publicity stunt, others a story of compassion. Tasha read the articles on her cracked phone screen, shaking her head at the distortions, the speculation. They did not know the truth of what had passed in that waiting room, the quiet humanity that had held her together when she was falling apart. She sighed, brushing her thumb over the image of Malik's face printed beneath the bold letters, knowing this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she could yet imagine. Back in the hospital, She stood once more outside, the glass panel of the pediatric unit, her eyes fixed on Jalen's small frame. Machines beeped steadily beside him, their rhythm oddly comforting now, proof that he was still here, still fighting. Her heart, though bruised by fear, swelled with relief as she whispered another prayer of thanks. But in the corner of her mind, she could not shake the image of Malik Jordan walking into the storm to help her when no one else did. That image, that moment, lingered with a gravity that she knew would not fade. And thus, from the chaos of a storm and the desperation of a mother's scream, two lives that had no reason to cross had been bound together by circumstance. It was the fragile beginning of a story neither of them could yet see, a story of resilience, compassion, and the unexpected ways love can take root in the soil of pain. The storm outside intensified as the limousine raced through the streets, lightning slicing the night sky in violent flashes that illuminated the fear on Tasha's face. She clung to the edge of the seat as if holding herself together, her damp hair plastered against her forehead, her chest heaving with every shallow breath she forced into her lungs. Her entire being was wrapped in one thought: her son had to live. She could not lose him. The idea of Jalen slipping away, of his tiny chest never rising again, pressed down on her like the weight of the world. It was unbearable, and yet it was happening right before her eyes. She could hear the faint, strained rhythm of Malik's voice as he spoke softly to her boy, urging him to stay awake, to fight for every breath. His tone carried a strange authority, not the authority of power or money, but of someone who had seen life teeter on the edge before, someone who understood desperation. Malik kept his composure, his focus sharp. He monitored Jalen's breathing with a steadiness that contrasted violently with the storm of panic swirling inside Tasha. She could not help but study him in the dim glow of the limo's interior lights. There was something in his posture, calm, grounded, deliberate, that seemed out of place in a man so obviously accustomed to a life of privilege. He did not recoil at her tears or her frantic cries. Instead, he leaned into the storm, meeting it with a presence that soothed even as she shook uncontrollably. He was no stranger to crisis. She could feel it. Just a little longer, Malik muttered, his eyes never leaving Jalen. We'll be there soon. His voice had the kind of assurance people clung to when everything else fell apart. For the first time that night, a small sliver of hope cracked through Tasha's fear. The limousine's wipers slashed furiously across the windshield as they sped into the emergency bay of Northwestern Memorial. Red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement, and the blur of motion outside came to a sudden halt as the vehicle braked hard. In an instant, the back doors were thrown open, and a team of medical staff swarmed the car with practiced precision. Malik passed the child into the waiting arms of the paramedics, his movements careful yet urgent. Tasha scrambled out after them, her bare feet slipping on the slick concrete as she tried to follow the stretcher that now carried her son into the bright chaos of the emergency department. Inside, the hospital felt like a fortress against the storm, a place where cold efficiency and the hum of fluorescent lights attempted to shield against the fragility of human life. The air was heavy with antiseptic, every corner alive with hurried footsteps and clipped medical orders. Tasha's legs nearly gave out as she stumbled toward the glass doors of the trauma bay, only to be stopped by a nurse. "Ma'am, please wait here." The words landed like a blow. Her arms instinctively reached out toward the retreating stretcher, but the nurse's hand on her shoulder was firm. Her world had shrunk to that single image, her son, hooked up to wires, swallowed by tubes, his tiny body dwarfed by the enormity of machines. She pressed her palm against the glass, whispering his name through trembling lips. The helplessness of standing on the other side of that barrier threatened to break her completely. And then beside her, Malik appeared again, his coat now damp from the rain as if he had been unwilling to shield himself from it. Without a word, he offered her a small paper cup of tea, steam curling up into the sterile air. She hadn't even noticed the hospital staff had handed it to him for her, but the gesture landed with unexpected warmth. "You should sit," he said gently, guiding her toward a row of plastic chairs along the wall. She obeyed, too numb to resist. Her hands wrapped around the cup, more for the heat than the taste, and she sipped absent-mindedly. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was thick with unspoken fears and strange, fragile comfort. Finally, her voice cracked through the stillness. I don't even know your name. Malik, he replied simply, his eyes steady on hers. Malik Jordan. The name hit her like a half-remembered tune. She had heard it before, on the news, in articles shared online, in whispers about one of the most powerful black men in America. A man who had built an empire not out of inheritance but out of determination and genius. Her lips parted in shock, but no words came. What could she possibly say to someone like him? She was a single mother working shifts that barely covered rent. A woman who rationed groceries and fought with landlords who knew she had no options. And yet here he was, sitting beside her in a waiting room, holding space for her in her darkest moment. I guess I owe you my son's life, she whispered finally, her voice thick with emotion. But Malik did not accept the compliment. He only looked at her, and in his gaze she caught something unexpected. A flicker of grief, of memory, of wounds not yet healed. He wasn't just a savior swooping in from a limousine. He was a man who had known the pain of loss and had sworn in his own way to fight against it. An hour crawled by, every tick of the clock dragging her nerves tighter. The storm outside had calmed, but inside her the tempest raged on. When the doors finally opened and the doctor emerged, her breath stopped. He's stable, the doctor said. Severe pneumonia, but he's going to be okay. You brought him just in time. The relief hit her like a wave, her knees giving way as she collapsed into the chair, tears spilling freely now. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her face, sobs breaking through as the unbearable fear melted into gratitude. Malik's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, not possessive, not demanding, just there. A quiet reminder that she was not alone in that moment. They sat side by side in that fluorescent-lit waiting room, strangers bound by crisis. Slowly, the barriers between them softened as words began to fill the silence. Tasha spoke haltingly at first about her life. The long hours at the diner, the struggles with her landlord, the impossible balancing act of bills, food, and medication. Her voice carried no self-pity, only the tired honesty of someone who had carried more than her share of burdens. Malik listened with a patience that surprised her, his expression unreadable yet attentive. And then softly he shared something of his own. He told her about Illa, his younger sister who had died at 9 years old from an asthma attack their family couldn't afford to treat. The memory was etched into him not as a scar but as a vow. That was the night I promised myself I'd fix the system, he said quietly, his eyes distant, fixed on a point only he could see. The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Tasha had no response, only silence, but it was the kind of silence that said she understood. Two lives, worlds apart in wealth and circumstance, intersected by grief and love for a child. Something fragile, unspoken but undeniably real, had begun to take shape in that waiting room. The storm and the cry for help. The rain fell in sheets, soaking the streets of Chicago until they gleamed like mirrors reflecting every neon sign and street lamp. It was the kind of storm that seemed to wash the city raw, rattling windows and drumming against rooftops with an urgency that felt alive. For most people, it was a night to stay indoors, curled up with hot tea, Netflix buzzing softly in the background, safe from the cold breath of the wind. But for Tasha Williams, safety had never come easily. She was out in the storm, clutching the small hand of her 3-year-old son Jalen as they hurried across Michigan Avenue. Her breath came in short bursts. She had just finished a grueling double shift at the diner where she worked, only to rush home and find her baby coughing violently, his forehead burning with fever. At first she thought it was just a cold, maybe the flu, but then his lips began to take on that terrifying tinge of blue, and the shallow wheeze in his chest grew weaker until, without warning, he went frighteningly still. Jalen. No, baby, stay with me, she begged, her voice breaking. Panic surged through her body like fire. She had no car, no money for an ambulance, and the nearest clinic had closed hours ago. So she ran, barefoot, across blocks that blurred together in her frantic desperation. Now, on the slick pavement under the punishing rain, she collapsed, clutching his limp little body against her chest. Please, she screamed, her voice raw. Somebody help me. My baby, he's not breathing. Her words tore into the night, but the city seemed deaf. Cars rolled by, their wipers slashing against windshields. Drivers too hurried or too wary to stop. A couple under a shared umbrella glanced at her, frowned, and then walked faster, muttering about another street performance. Tasha shook as tears mingled with the rain. She rocked her son back and forth, praying for a miracle. Not far away, a sleek black limousine purred to a stop in front of Label Duaca, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Laughter spilled into the storm as a group of men in tailored suits stepped out, shaking hands and trading boasts about quarterly profits. Among them was Malik Jordan, the billionaire CEO of Jordan MedTech, a company whose cutting-edge software had revolutionized early disease detection. At 42, he was one of the most influential black entrepreneurs in America, a man both admired and envied. Normally, Malik moved through the world with a quiet, disciplined stride, never letting much of his inner life leak into his public image. Tonight was no different, at least until he heard the scream. He froze mid-step, his polished shoes splashing against a shallow puddle. For a moment, he almost ignored it. Chicago was full of noise, full of stories you couldn't always stop to hear. But then he saw her. A woman soaked through, kneeling on the sidewalk with a small child cradled in her arms. The way she screamed, desperate, primal, cut through Malik's practiced detachment like a blade. The men he was with didn't even glance her way. One muttered, "These streets, man. Always some drama." Another chuckled and lit a cigar under the awning. But Malik couldn't look away. He stepped forward, loosening his tie as he moved toward her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. Tasha looked up at him, eyes wide with terror. "He's not breathing." "My baby, please." Malik dropped to his knees without hesitation. His hands, steady from years of practice in both boardrooms and charity clinics, pressed against the boy's tiny neck. A pulse, faint. His chest shallow, barely rising. "We don't have time," Malik muttered. He turned his head toward the limo. "Driver, get to Northwestern Memorial, now." The chauffeur reacted instantly, swinging the back door open. Malik gently lifted the boy from his mother's trembling arms. "No, wait," Tasha protested, terrified to let go. "I'll sit with him," Malik said firmly. "You're coming too. Let's go." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Who was this stranger in the storm? This man whose clothes alone looked worth more than her entire apartment. But the soundless rise and fall of Jalen's chest made the choice for her. She climbed in. The limo roared into motion, tires hissing against wet asphalt. Inside, the air was warm, leather seats smelling faintly of cedar. Malik laid Jalen across his lap, tearing off his own scarf to wipe the boy's face and tilt his head back for clearer airways. "Stay with me, little man," Malik whispered, almost as if speaking to his own past. Tasha sat rigid, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes darted between the man and her son. "Why are you doing this?" she asked hoarsely. Malik looked up, his gaze steady. "Because no one else did."